Hello, everyone, and welcome back to RYTHM Connect, the official podcast of RYTHM Foundation. On this show, we engage with incredible people driving real change in their communities. I'm your host, Umayal Eswaran, and I'm glad you're here for our latest episode. Through this show, we aim to bring you powerful stories about ordinary people who have made an extraordinary impact on the lives of others. We hope you have enjoyed our previous episodes. Your feedback means the world to us, so don't hesitate to reach out on our social media channels. You'll find all the links you need in the episode description. I'm delighted to introduce you to today's guest, who is a force of nature concerning politics and public policy in Malaysia. She is Dr. Tricia Yeoh, the CEO of the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or IDEAS. If her name sounds familiar, that's because she has been featured in prominent media platforms like The Economist, CNN, Al Jazeera, and Bloomberg, among others. She is a leading researcher and governance expert, the recipient of the Meritorious Service Award conferred by the Selangor Sultan. She is also a board member for the IDEAS Foundation, which runs several centers for children with autism from low-income households. This year, Tricia was recognized by Wiki Impact. It did a list of 100 change makers creating real impact in Malaysia in the social justice category. We at RYTHM Foundation admire her passion for public policy, and I am thrilled that she's here with us today to talk about IDEA's efforts for inclusive education. Tricia, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor, that it's Sri Umayal, to be invited on this podcast. And I may also congratulate RYTHM Foundation, not just on the podcast, but on all the other efforts that the foundation has done over the last 2 decades in its endeavor to reach out to the marginalized communities. So I think we share a lot of similarities in that respect.
I think so. I've read a lot, I think, about you, and I've seen your work on the public policy and also working with the communities. And I think when it comes to public policy, you have to work with different departments and government departments and various other entities. And it's not an easy task. So I'm going to come back to ask you what drove you to do this? What was behind it?
Yeah, it's definitely a very specialized area. I think you don't grow up thinking that you want to work in public policy. It's not something that children know very much about in the first place.
No.
I would say that it drives me because I really wanted to work on social injustice. I think feeling and seeing the kind of injustice that marginalized communities in Malaysia, as well as beyond, undergo, that was probably my starting point. Specifically, people who are living in poverty, marginalized communities. In fact, children with learning disabilities. I remember when I was in university, I was already volunteering at the Learning Disability Center. This is way before thinking about career development or anything of that sort. So I think social injustice and having a passion for that drove me to working in public policy, simply because you come to a point where you realize that in many countries, change doesn't happen until and unless public policies are addressed. Meaning that if you want to address a certain problem, it's one thing to be able to do it piecemeal by, providing food to villagers, but it's another thing at a completely different level where you're able to address it from the government policy side, because that really is creating long-term, meaningful, and much more systemic institutional impact. But it's also that much harder. So I think I've kind of come full circle in believing that change has to happen both ways. So you need to have it from the bottom up, to have examples, case studies of what, people like us in the private sector, the third wing, so to speak, can do, and as well as addressing it from the top down, the institutional front, which takes longer, is a lot more challenging, as you said, a lot more stakeholders in the process. You have to speak to policymakers, politicians who don't often understand the issues at hand, and then also trying to promote it through policy advocacy, which is a different set of skills required, right? Like you're talking about communicating it to the public, creating the public demand for a certain policy change, and all that takes a lot of time. So I would say it starts from the feeling of wanting to do something for the people who have been treated badly in society, but also realizing that, look, it only happens long term if you address it at the policy level.
Yeah, coming back to that, because you say that we can do by piecemeal, but unless and until there is a solid policy that governs, then nothing can be done in a systematic way, right? So I want to talk about the policies, right, for special needs in Malaysia. I know that you have written a paper in 2021, but that's very recent. Now, we have journeyed with our school for the last 12 years, and it's not been an easy journey for us because there's nothing that's readily available in Malaysia from awareness, starting with that, even with policies or, what's even there. There is a charter per se, but how much of that is implemented, on the ground, and how much of that has been achieved is a question. So parents continue to have difficulties as well today, if you have a special child, as in what is the process, from a diagnostic point of view, and where do you take your child. So if there was a policy, from a government point of view, then this will, and also with the support of government bodies and education ministry, this will make a lot of things easier for parents. So my question to you is, from your perspective and being involved in this as well, where do you see us wanting Malaysia, as in, from a perspective of special needs, and what can be done, and in terms of also policy, is that how important it is for us to move forward?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Very important questions. So actually, it's great to know that you have this center, and I think your center caters to children of a very wide age range. So IDEAS also experimented with something called the IDEAS Autism Center, and this started in 2012. So 2012, it actually happened by chance. I think it was a child of one of our staff who had autism, and we had an opportunity to plug a certain amount of money in for any sort of charitable project. And so he took the idea up to the then CEO, and we said, look, there is an opportunity gap here, especially if you're talking about providing services, care, education for people who are in the bottom 40s. So people who are, coming from extreme abject poverty, they would not be able to afford these services that are typically provided by private sector outside.
True.
So that has also been our journey. I'll talk about that in a while. But just to say that I think it's interesting and quite unique for IDEAS to be able to have that experience as on the ground, learning, having a center, dealing with teachers, parents, families, children who come from the bottom 40, and learning from their culture as well, where it's sometimes a taboo to talk about special needs. Parents as well may not accept that their children are going through this, and they still subject themselves to certain cultural practices which are not healthy or helpful for their children.
True.
And all of this is a learning experience for us. But I wanted to say that it's unique because we also have the think tank arm.
Yeah.
So having the center as a case study,
Yes.
as a sort of pilot to learn from, and then be able to do the research, really helps us to take it upon ourselves as a think tank to write, reflect, and develop policy proposals.
I think you're in a better position. You have the school, you have this center, so you can, when you're making these policies, you can actually learn, because it's a journey with the school, and you see the gaps. As you have well said in your paper as well. So we can see the gaps, but what, like in our journey with Tarana, the school that we have, that we see is that it's kind of starts from parents not seeing the importance of that the children being diagnosed actually what is wrong with them. So sometimes it's too late, that when they want to start a therapy, or when they want to do something for a kid, it's already, a child is already like, anything beyond already 5 years old, it's too late, because the younger you start, you can actually help the child. So parents don't see that. So we even see kids coming at the age of 10 to us, and before that nothing has been done. And then the journey for the parents start, because where do you go from there? Because yes, we talk about inclusive education, but I think as a society, we have to come to realize that not all children can be in that inclusive environment, right? Because I think Malaysia today, Malaysian education, from the perspective of special needs, they keep emphasizing on the inclusive education. So I have a different view on that, in terms of not all of those kids are going to be able to be in an inclusive environment, right? So I think the policies that are going to come out or going to be made, which is important for these schools, there also has to be schools specifically for special need education. What is your perspective on that?
Sure. Yeah. So I think in terms of our policy recommendations, we did write this paper. It's called Falling Through the Cracks, Identifying Children with Learning Difficulties in Malaysian Schools. This was in 2021. But we also had done a previous policy paper. That one was looking at the difficulties of actually setting up these centers. So the point is that like private centers exist, it's actually unaffordable for most people.
Yeah.
But coming back to your question on policy, in terms of what we have recommended, of course, it falls into a few broad categories, right? So one is we think that the Ministry of Education needs to do a lot more in terms of addressing the issues of competency and skills through training programs and learning support specialists in mainstream schools.
Yes.
Because we find that actually teachers are themselves unable to provide this kind of quality instruction.
Okay.
I know that teachers may be given some kind of modules, but it's really not enough to say one module that can encapsulate everything, because we know that there are a whole range of developmental disabilities, including, to name just a few, of course, autism spectrum disorder, which we know, but also Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, other intellectual disabilities. And these teachers are not necessarily trained in the different types of learning disabilities, and therefore how do you cater to the teachers, actually. So I think a big emphasis on teacher training is absolutely crucial.
Yes.
The second one, of course, is greater collaboration between the Ministry of Education, so the schools, as well as the Ministry of Health. So because the learning difficulties, and we are still learning about these learning difficulties, right? I mean, I think there's a lot more research that emerges every day. So we would require these health professionals like pediatricians, psychologists, speech language therapists, occupational therapists to be able to come into the education system and provide their own diagnosis as well. So I think currently what you have is these allied health services under the school system are only available in 12 special education schools and 1 in the special education division of MOE in the entire nation. So you're talking about a very limited constraints as well. So if you were to expand this, the recommendation would be to ensure that there's greater availability for these allied health services in schools, and the collaboration between the two ministries, because you cannot just leave it to the MOE's devices.
No.
It is a health issue that the MOH needs to come in for as well. And finally, to expand the allied health training programs and provide this allied health support in the mainstream schools. So I think, in short, like what you were saying as to whether it's inclusive education or to set up dedicated special education schools, I think that debate will continue. Ideally, if you have special education schools exclusively, they would have the support they require. Inclusive education, that's possible, but only if the teachers themselves are given sufficient training, and also whether they know how to integrate the students in the same classroom.
Exactly.
Because students will be coming in at completely different levels.
Yes.
And can the students cope with the
curriculum
and the peer integration as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we are on the same page that in terms of that, because I'm saying I'm not for inclusive education, but I think they need to look at both. As in, you must have a school, for special needs, and also have the inclusive education in the mainstream as well. Now, if kids from special education schools, let's say, if you set up, and if they can be integrated into the main, like you said, if the teachers are able to, integrate, then, then it will be able to do that. But otherwise, is just, let's say, for these teachers, because we need teachers. That's one of the challenges that we face as in our school as well. Today, if I go out there and I look for special needs qualified teachers, you don't find many of them who are graduates. Now, if you look at other nations per se who have gone leaps and bounds, like, let's say we look at Australia, there it's the teachers have to be graduates, from special needs. But whereas here, it's not there. I mean, these teachers are just being trained. So is that going to be enough if they are just trained, or you are given a training for, let's say, 3 to 6 months, and then you call that teacher a special needs teacher?
Yeah, so I think it's not just the teachers. I mean, yes, that point is absolutely right. And the teachers need to be qualified, which means that the kind of the courses that are being offered at the graduate level, undergraduate level, there needs to be more courses that are offered in the various national universities. But apart from teachers, I think you're also looking at right now the issue of very limited allied health professionals, such as you're talking about educational psychologists, speech language pathologists, occupational therapists, in the public health and education sectors. I think this is something that, parent groups and stakeholders have long talked about.
Yeah.
But these allied health supporters specialize in different areas. I think we need to be able to also ensure that Malaysia is producing these kinds of qualified individuals, and they need to be integrated within the systems, because ultimately it's teachers, but it's also these allied healthcare professionals, being able to integrate them, and that will affect the efficacy of any sort of intervention.
So we are talking about, basically, your paper talks about looking at it from an holistic approach, because we need to look at teachers, we need to look at the specialists, of course, parents, as well as caregivers. We are looking at that whole spectrum. Let's just say we want to call it that. And where do you see Malaysia today? Because you have now, of course, your paper came out in 2021, and do you see us getting anywhere with whatever you have proposed in terms of these public policies, to gown this inclusive education? Where will you see ourselves? Let's say today is 2024, so that's about 3 years. I would pretty much can say probably nothing much has been done. But will we wake up to this? Because there's more kids who are being born with autism and different other spectrums. Now, as a country, some of us might choose to basically live in that world and ignore it, but that is the reality today. Do you see Malaysia waking up to this and doing something about it, and us not being 50 years behind in terms of comparatively? But that's where we are right now for special needs education. Where do you see ourselves, let's say, in the next 5 years?
So I would say, firstly, from 2020 or even 2021 until now, there has been just a lot of political changes.
Yes.
The governments have changed several times. Prime ministers changed, therefore cabinet and Minister of Education changed. So because of these changes, it's been really difficult to even understand what the policy priorities are for any of the ministries. I mean, Ministry of Education is one of the biggest, with the largest budgets, with the largest number of civil servants. So very difficult to execute any change. So I would say a short answer to that question would be no. However, I think the former Minister of Education, Asli Malik, he was very passionate actually about learning disabilities. He actually implemented zero reject policy, which was supportive of special needs education in that it would prompt diverse learning methods and pedagogical innovations in mainstream schools to make them inclusive and disabled friendly. But he, as we know, was only in office for a very short period. The current Education Minister, Fadlina Siddiq, has introduced a concept called Pendidikan Manusiawi. I don't know how to translate that. I think it's just basically to ensure that no child is left behind in having access to quality education. And I understand that they are trying to extend the Special Education Integrated Program, this is the PPK, to all mainstream schools. And the Ministry of Health and Education also kickstarted something called the Hospital School Program, where students who are receiving treatment in hospitals can get access to a supportive learning environment and are not left behind. But when it comes to, I mean, these are just like narrow programs, right? If you're talking about a wholesale shift in change of thinking, I would say we are nowhere close to where our international counterparts are. We have a long way to go. However, having said that, I think there are a lot of initiatives from the private sector and from the third sector, right? Like people like us. So I talked about our autism center earlier. We have two, one in Rawang and one in Nilai. And over the last 2 years, there's suddenly been this huge influx of requests that have come in from all kinds of different people, ranging from, geographically speaking, from Langkawi to locally in KL here. And I think my team, I'm not management on this side, I'm just on the board, but they have been going around the whole country providing trainings. And I think there is an interest there. The demand is definitely greater.
It's greater.
The demand is greater than the supply.
Yes.
Because as we talked about, there's a shortage of people who specialize in this area. And I hope that in the future, this means that there'll be more younger Malaysians who are going to take up specializing in these sorts of courses, so that when there is initiative, then they'll be able to match that demand. But I just have to say that from the government policy side, definitely it's still very much lacking, and we need to do more, because special needs is an area that, we already, people who cannot understand it, those who can afford it, they can provide some kind of specialist therapy. But for those who cannot afford it in the smaller states, for example, they really don't have very much nowhere to turn to.
We are seeing those challenges as well. I think that's where maybe the private sector and maybe like your policies has to be pushed in to the government sector, because it's nice to say no one left behind and all that. Those taglines look good, but like you said, if we don't tackle this holistically, right? I think it starts also with students in school to encourage them to become special need teachers, because a lot of them just think about just becoming, teachers, but they're not looking at becoming special needs teachers. So like you said, there's a lot of interest from different other states as well. But even for us, if we open even in another state, our concern is also, where do we get teachers? Where do we get healthcare workers? How do we provide those services? And also, like, all these, the therapists that you need is also not cheap. So then again, you put back on the parents, they can't really afford. So we are kind of stuck in that cycle, right? And I think that's where, at least if the government doesn't have a solid policy, but if, let's say like people like you come out with these policies, I think they need to wake up and look at these policies and say, okay, so how do we integrate this into what we have and make it work maybe one step at a time?
Yeah. So I think there are definitely ways around it. So the long-term measure would be to encourage students to take up more of these courses, to get the government's, Ministry of Health and Education together to encourage and motivate these courses in the university. So that's a kind of a long-term thing, because it takes some number of years before these courses are taken up and the graduates come out into market. But the shorter term, I think, stopgap measure is to take existing teachers, right?
Yes.
And to drill into them the kind of understanding, the compassion, and then provide them the tools that are necessary. So a lot of this training is needed before they can be qualified to take on the very difficult task, actually, of understanding what it means to cater for students who have these sorts of learning difficulties. So I think it is possible, but even that has to be a policy, right?
Yes.
That's introduced by the government to say that, okay, look, we're going to take a certain percentage of our teachers out from the service and really put them through this kind of service and understanding, and then put them back into the schools. Yeah.
So that's what every time when I'm talking, I always say, I think we need the will of our government, because it is this much what the private sector can do. You and me can do only this much, but it's their will that's going to drive this, and then we can all be part of it, and, and then, we can help, and we can, get on that same train. But I think until and unless our government bodies wake up and there's strong policies that's governing this holistically, I'm talking, not just one. I mean, if you just get the, teachers, but you don't do any others, let they look at that, the allied health team that's coming in, or not looking at the schools, as in you can do both, but you need to look at how a child can cope with it. So until and unless that understanding is there, then it's going to be an uphill task for us. But like you said, I think there's been a lot of awareness being created. From what I saw 10 years ago and today, I can see the difference. But I think still that at the pace we are moving, I think we can move a little bit more faster. I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Of course, on the MOE side, there's a lot that they need to pick up on so that they can implement it throughout the 10,000 public schools in Malaysia. And if you think about how deeply layered this problem can be as well. So you've got children with learning disabilities, and then you've got access to education in the rural kampong areas, the villages, right, that are so difficult to access. And we're also doing work on Orang Asli, which I know RYTHM Foundation also does work in. So if you take Orang Asli children in the most remote villages, and if they have children who also have learning disabilities, there are a lot of complex layering here which the teachers also need to be able to cater to. But my other point was that I think while we expect MOE to do that, I think, hope is not all lost, where we can take great examples, which we are doing, I think, collectively in the third sector, but also, let's say, a company wants to sponsor a school and has all the necessary curriculum that's maybe brought in from international schools abroad, and then being able to use that as a successful case study And that case study can be reported on, can be forwarded to the ministry, and the ministry will see, okay, this is a successful case study. What are the things that we can take from this and integrate into my own schools? So sometimes it's a lot about selling that story and what that narrative is as well.
Yeah.
And I'll just talk a little bit about our Orang Asli work because it's related. So our Orang Asli work we've done in the last 2 years, a big project on education among Orang Asli students. And we came up with a very long policy paper that had 12 policy recommendations, which we forwarded to the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education actually was quite open and receptive to it. So they organized a big meeting where they called all the division heads of within the Ministry of Education. As I said, it's so big. And they actually actively asked, okay, which of these recommendations is the Ministry of Education already doing within schools? And the person who was in charge of the meeting called up their division heads to answer that question. And I thought that was just brilliant because then it means that this is the real intersection between where our think tank work can create impact, where the MOE is actively asking their division heads to implement certain policy recommendations there. And not only that, I think we also had some really great feedback from other education providers in the Orang Asli education space who also have started to take up our recommendations in their own implementation of programs. And our hope eventually in the long run is that we can take examples of all this and say, look, it's been working. One of the examples would be to be able to introduce indigenous pedagogy into the schooling curriculum. And if that can be done successfully, then we bring that story back to the MOE and say, look, you know, this is working. Can we share our methodology and tools with you? So I think the same thing can happen for special needs as well, right? Like, so if we have these clear recommendations which can be implemented in existing case studies, and then we bring it back to the MOE. So I guess it's not ideal. MOE should be the one, but it's an iterative process that I think, you know, we just have to take what we can get.
I agree with you. I think I've had this conversation with my team as well and say that, you know, maybe that's what we should focus on, making our school that ideal school where, you know, so we can take it and tell them, okay, this is where, you know, we have a school that we have set up and this is what it'll work. And so maybe you take this as an example and then, you know, you do what you have to do. You know, so like you said, it's not an ideal situation. And I mean, we have worked with them as well, Minister of Education. I mean, even in the past, under different people. I mean, they're always welcoming. Even when we have a conference, they come on send. You know, they do that. So I think the will is there. It's not that it's not there. But I think sometimes it's just they're like, I think they're also struggling where to begin, right? And so it gets stuck. So I think this is where maybe we, like, you know, people like you and us as well, who have a school and who have gone through and we know what the challenges are and we are also talking about that model school, creating that model school so that can be maybe replicated, you know, by the government. So I think, yes, I agree with you. It's not the ideal way. But we have to start somewhere, isn't it? Because otherwise, these kids are going to fall through the cracks.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, after this, I'm going to approach your team and say maybe we should do a research study on these two schools.
I was just looking at,
we're doing.
I mean,
what are the commonalities of key success factors that we found to be crucial for the development of students in these schools? And what are the challenges? And surely there are lessons there that policymakers would like to hear about.
Yeah, and then because you have, that's what your strength is, to look at what the gaps are and your policy. And I think we are talking about coming up with a model school. So you never know, maybe we, you know, if we both the teams talk and maybe we can do something and give that ideal situation to the ministry and ask them to do something.
Yeah, I mean, everything can be researched, you know, and research has a conclusion that we can always take up to the government and decision makers.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, yes, I mean, I always say if we sit here, we can talk about what are the challenges. We have to talk about the challenges. Otherwise, we will not understand what we need to do. But I don't want to get stuck in the challenges. I think if we keep talking about it, we can be there, or we can come out of it and say, okay, these challenges exist. They're going to exist. Maybe they might take another 10 years for us to even, see them wake up and say, oh yeah, we need to do something for special needs. But what can we do today? That we can do it and take those small steps so that these kids don't fall through the cracks. They do get an opportunity to either it's go to a center or go to a school, or they are being diagnosed as early as possible, and also educating the parents. Sometimes it's a challenge as well, because the parents, like especially in our school, that we see that sometimes they just take the kids, and the reasons they give us why the child cannot stay in the school, for me, it sounds like not acceptable at all, because your child needs to be there. And despite seeing improvements, their reasons and why they want to take becomes more important than that child's life. So these are all, I think it's all about educating the parents as well, why these kids need to go to the school, and sometimes they expect these kids to like wake up the next day and become good in maths or science or English, and not realize they are not like the ordinary kids, so they can only do this much.
Yeah.
So I think we need to kind of recognize that as well. So I think educating the parents is also important.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the parents of these children. I think it's like educating
the
communities
community
and
itself,
parents
yeah.
at large, right? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about these children.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of expectations, false expectations
Yes.
of what they can and cannot do.
True.
And to be able to explain it in a way that is sensitive to their own character and nature, I think that is the kind of sensitivities that we need to introduce within our society and culture.
I mean, you have been coming up with all these policies, and and you have seen challenges as well. But what are some takeaways or experiences that you would say as in you have achieved based on all these policies that you have come up with, and because these are to benefit the community? There's stories to tell, or there's success.
Yeah, policy impact is always the ideal goal
Yes.
that we want to achieve in all of our work. I would say that it's when we create conversations among the policymakers, even among the parliamentarians, that we would really like to celebrate that. And you can take the same subject matter and just supplant it with something else. But I'll give an example of our work, which has been very, very difficult, a very challenging uphill battle on political financing reforms. So we're trying to push for a political financing law in Malaysia, which currently does not exist.
Wow. Okay.
So it's complex, it's sensitive, parties don't want it. They prefer there not to be transparency because
Of
they
course.
can do, whatever they want. But we actually set up what's called an all-party parliamentary group on political financing, in which we kind of disrupt the system by getting MPs to join it on an individual basis. And you can actually set up an APPG on anything. It's a relatively new mechanism that exists in the UK and other Commonwealth systems, but in Malaysia we haven't really done that very much. And it's less formal than a parliamentary select committee because it can be driven by civil society groups like us. So an APPG on political financing allows the MPs from different sides of the divide to come together to discuss something that's considered controversial, sensitive, and actually it's part of an education process as well. So imagine if we could set up APPGs on anything, an APPG on special needs education,
Yeah.
an APPG on Orang Asli, an APPG on, whatever subject matter, you name it. I'm just saying that is actually considered one of the success stories for us, because now we've introduced into the lexicon or the narrative. And today you can see that the cabinet has already approved it, that there needs to
Nice.
be a political financing act. Whether or not it will come is a different matter. But the fact that they have agreed to it, because there has been public demand,
Yes.
we get it out in the media, people talk about it. MPs now know that that's essential. If there is to be any political reform, that act is necessary. So I think a similar example could be true, and we could definitely replicate that for other issues. That's one. Another case study and a good success would probably be our work around rare diseases. So very specialized area as well. But with that one, we directly worked with the Ministry of Health, and we worked on developing a rare disease white paper. The white paper could not be executed eventually because the government fell. But the white paper contained a recommendation to set up what's called a rare disease trust fund. And the trust fund was set up by a subsequent government that was of a different minister. So the trust fund exists. It's not very active at the moment, but then it can be tapped into for patients who have rare diseases. And it's an example, a model that was taken from Singapore and other countries that have such trust funds. So I think these two are things that we like to, speak about, because it's a combination of research and advocacy.
Yes.
It's evidence-based research. We know that these are the things that are helpful. This is what's going to help communities and our society function better. And we worked really hard in getting these two things pushed up to the policymaker level.
Yeah. So like you said, whether it's going to be made a policy or not, at least people start talking. And I think they agree to the fact at least it's a one step ahead of nothing, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, so it's always a struggle. But I think the fact is, like we say about our school as well for special needs, I mean, it's a struggle, but we're not going to give up. We are just going to keep pushing forward until, one day we see actually this, whatever we want, this materializes.
Yeah. And if I just may add as well, like policy advocacy, it really is an art. It requires the skill of knowing when is the right time to actually enter.
Yeah.
Like judging from something that happens in society. I don't know, people suddenly starting to talk about special needs. I think Kyrie's wife just set up a new podcast called Kita Family, and their son has autism.
He's autistic.
Well. Yes, that's right.
Autistic,
so now they're starting to talk about it. Actually, I would argue that this is a ripe time to bring up these policy recommendations again.
I think so.
Because there's interest.
I think you should push the 2021 again now.
Yeah, maybe we can say like 3 years later, where are we?
Yeah.
And then you kind of take advantage of whatever interest there is.
Yeah.
And I don't know, coincide it with some launch of, say, the PISA results, right?
Yeah.
Everyone likes to look at the PISA results.
Yeah.
And then, we need a few things to triangulate, and then you actually have a perfect storm to get in and then talk about an issue. And then you will see people taking it up. I mean, it requires a lot of coordination, money, of course, funding, resources, personnel, working with the media, working with parliament, working with private sector or academics as well are very important. So I think what I'm just trying to say is that it is possible to champion any public policy cause. A lot of organization, thinking, planning, and strategic coordination is needed, but it really is possible to do anything. I do believe that now, because we've worked on other challenging issues.
Yeah.
But it really, it does require a lot of work. And it's long term as well.
Yeah.
I think we said this in the past in the podcast already, but you have to dedicate at least 5 years to championing one thing and one thing alone, and that is possible.
I think these topics need to be discussed, in order for us to understand the difficulties on the ground. What do we need to do? And also to collaborate, because sometimes one voice, not everybody hears it. So I think we need to come together. So I think that's one of the things that I've been already thinking while you are talking about your policy and IDEAS Autism School and IDEAS Foundation and what you're doing. And, and so I think there are areas that, we can collaborate as well.
Yeah, sure.
You know,
Governments are made up of people who are politicians, and politicians respond well, or they respond best to coalitions. So politicians want to see, or no, not they want to see, they will only respond and react when they see a band of people representing a large majority of the population. And then they will imagine that, oh, this is something that will get me popular as well. I'm going to act on it. So coalition building absolutely is essential for this kind of work.
thank you for your time today. Although, we have done our blueprints from our conferences and all that, but public policy making, it's like you said, it's not easy, and it's time consuming, and I think it's more like a long-term battle that hoping to win the battle, and to see that our parliamentarians and our government bodies accept it. And, even if they start talking about it, like you said, then we know we have achieved something, because sometimes people just don't even think about it, that's going to happen. So I think this gives even our audience, an insight probably into what is even public policy making, a little bit of it, and also about the situations and what it is about special education in Malaysia.
Yes, well, thank you so much. And I hope the listeners enjoy listening to this as well. We hope that there'll be more
I hope so
impetus
too.
for change. Maybe more people will start to take up special needs education as a course.
That's what we want them to do. We want more younger generation, younger people, who are, coming out of school and thinking of what I'm going to do. Maybe this is their way of giving back to the community, the community that has brought them up. I think it's a way of giving if they want to do teaching. So I always say, I think if we can have more of them thinking in that way of serving community, then whatever we have done, we know that we have achieved something where we get the younger generation to think about their community and their society.
Yes, sure.
Tricia, thank you so much for being on the show and enlightening us with your insights. I'm sure our audience has gained a deeper understanding of what it takes to really drive positive impact in the long term. And to our audience, I hope you're feeling motivated and inspired by Dr. Tricia Yeoh and IDEAS' hard work in transforming Malaysia through effective public policies, good governance, and public accountability. It's not fast and it's never easy, but it's worth it. You too can play a vital role in shifting perspectives about special needs by encouraging inclusion in your own communities. No matter how modest the effort, you can help create ripples of positive change. Remember to subscribe to our podcast for alerts on the newest episodes streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcasts. And be sure to follow Rhythm Foundation, that's RYTHM, on Facebook and Instagram to learn more about our work worldwide. The links are listed in the episode description. Join us next time as we continue to bring you more stories of change, resilience, and innovation. Until then, keep spreading positivity and remember, we are all in this together.